We're just so happy that Spring Hill Day is here and that we got such gorgeous weather for it. This is the first time that Spring Hill Day has ever been held, and we have been a National Historic District for 12 years. We were put on the National Register of Historic Places in the year 2010. And this is the first time in those 12 years that we've had a Spring Hill-wide History Day. We've had history events at various places, but it's wonderful to have all of it going today, and so many nice people showing up. We really were very busy this morning. In fact, I think the Quaker Meeting House was entirely parked up, like not another space. People had to come down the road and park down here.
That's an aerial photograph of Spring Hill taken in 1951. That's very interesting because it shows the pattern of farm fields, and it gives you an idea of how open it was at that time. I had the good fortune to have many connections with Spring Hill, and as a village, it's we don't think of Spring Hill as being a village in the sense of having a store and a gas station and that sort of a village. Spring Hill was a farming village, and obviously a home to the Quaker meeting. I fairly recently realized I have two sides to my ancestral, or at least two sides that are prominent. One is the Quaker branch, which is through Hoxie's, the Hoxie family, and the other is through the Nye family, and I'm well connected with the Nye Museum in East Sandwich. And the difference is the Nyes fought in all the wars, and the Quakers avoided all the wars. So I felt that gave me some sort of a balance of some sort. But as I said, I've had the good fortune to have many connections with Spring Hill. I've been attending the meeting here since 1982, and I'll speak a little more about the Quakers later on. But I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the geography of Spring Hill and the fact that there is a hill. I heard someone comment the other day, they were emphasizing to someone that there is a hill, even though it's grown up and forested, not as open as it used to be. But Spring Hill itself is about, I consider it, sort of a low dome of a hill, about a quarter of a mile long. We're at the southeast end of it here, and about 90 feet high. Geographically, I think Spring Hill is a very beautiful place in the context of subtle beauty that you find here on Cape Cod here. Quite early on, there were some family names that I guess you might say they stayed. Hoxie, Giffords, Nyes, and a few others. And those families persisted, maybe that isn't the best word, they were able to continue farming on the same family homesteads for a long time. And things changed a little more around 1900. And each town was supposed to have a pastor that guided the people spiritually, and in fact was a part of the Puritan approach to having a state government, a church and state were blended together very well. And there were accepted ways of doing things from the Puritan point of view. And they took a dim view of people who tried to do otherwise. The situation in Sandwich, we had a pastor named William Leverich, and he had some differences or was not feeling comfortable with the Boston Puritan approach. And he left for Long Island in 1654. And for several years, the town had no pastor. And it was an interesting situation because Sandwich people developed a reputation, you might say, of being a little more liberal thinking, or perhaps a better word is tolerant, or perhaps even better yet, interested in other forms of worship. And it was into that environment that the Quaker influence came in 1657. And the way that occurred was through two men initially, an Englishman named Christopher Holder and John Copeland. And they had, this was on their second trip to New England. And as I understand it in my reading, they became used to a certain pattern when they came to New England, which they did on several trips. The pattern, let's cite the one in 1656. They took a ship and they disembarked at Newport, Rhode Island, and quite soon were ushered to Martha's Vineyard. And quite soon were conducted across the Sound to Falmouth. And they made their way to Sandwich. And I say that in that way because they weren't welcome, you know, by many of the people. They were, their word, their style of worship and approach to Christianity was very different. Without getting into all the details, I can just mention a couple that were critical. One was that the Friends, which, and by the way, the Friends or Quaker movement began with an Englishman named George Fox in the 1640s. And he very quickly gained a lot of adherents, and some of these people came to New England, and that's how this unfolded.
And you know, Sandwich was founded in 1637. It's the oldest town on the Cape. And the Quakers came in 1657, 20 years after the founding of the town. And that's less than 10 years after George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, really started the religious society of Friends. Less than 10 years. They got here. And they got here almost 20 years before William Penn came to found Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So this is the original place for the Quakers in America. Isn't that amazing? So it's a very special place.
Friends believe that there's that of God within each person, and we should strive to recognize that guidance is available through silence and the intuition which can follow. Each person can be considered a minister or capable of ministry in any given moment. And ideas like that, which did not sit well with the Puritan approach, which was to have a strong, as I said, church-state relationship. Citizens were expected to support the minister, and the Friends did not want to do that. They refused to do it and quickly got into trouble for that reason. So these were some of the ideas that were colliding, in a sense, at that time. But the Copeland and Holder found many people interested in their ideas in Sandwich. And by 1657, the next year, there were reportedly 18 families in the fairly new settlement of Sandwich who were adherents to the Quaker approach. And they were well received and met in people's houses, typically, and spread their ideas. It didn't take long, for the authorities to clamp down on this. And without going into too much detail, I'll say that from 1657 through the next few years, conditions were quite rough for the Quakers or Friends. We use either term, the Society of Friends or Quakers.
We found our house 7 years ago and fell in love with it, and didn't realize how it was embedded in the history of Spring Hill. And the reason I say that is because the Ahonen family were the family of Finnish farmers who owned and farmed the cranberry bogs around Spring Hill for almost all of the 20th century. Now, the Ahonens lived in the old house next door, which you'll see. The Ahonens lived there. Their son, Nilo, built this house in the 1930s. And then he married his wife, Ella. They raised a family here. And so this house has a lot of history connected to Spring Hill, even though it's a relatively new house. It's only 90 years old, not 290 years old, like some of them.
So this is the Clark Hoxie house,
Which actually was the earliest place where the Quaker meetings were held.
This is the burial grounds of the Quakers. And so the burial grounds were granted to the Quakers in 1695. And this portion of the house was also built in the 1690s. We dated it with David Wheelock, who is the caretaker over at Wing House. And so he can tell that from the hand-hewn beams and the water-hewn boards up top. And so typical of a Cape Cod house, this was a quarter cape, and it was built back in the 1690s. And then this portion was added on in the 1750s, and then it became a three-quarter cape. And so there are 3 fireplaces, and they all have their own flues that go up into this single chimney upstairs. And so when we moved in, we just wanted to keep as much of the history there, but then also make it more livable. So the whole front we made more historic by replacing all the windows with 8/12, and then the back is all more modern, so we could look at this landscape. We bought this house from the Ahonen family, who bought this in 1906. They farmed all the bogs on this street, over 40 acres of bogs, I believe. There are 65 Quakers buried here, and they also made space for freedmen and servants who otherwise wouldn't have a place to be buried. That's all within this, and this property floats as like a little piece of land within this other larger property.
They did the cemetery before headstones, so that's why you don't see any headstones in the cemetery.
The Friends, to their credit, persevered in their faith and in their guidance, and managed to survive through it. But the persecution was rough. I have one little quote I'm going to read you that took place at the William Allen House. Hopefully you'll all visit the present owners are calling it the Clark Hoxie House, just down the street. Beautiful farmhouse, beautiful land, which was the original home site and farm of William Allen, who was one of the early leaders. And it is said that the first meetings were in the original house that was on that site. And the Marshal, George Barlow, in one particular incident, came to seize property. I think the story goes he left Priscilla Allen with 1 cow. Her husband was in jail, and it was a very difficult situation. But this little story typifies, I think. Also, they took, this is by the way, what I'm reading from is a reprint of a chapter from Deo's History of Barnstable County in 1890. It has a wonderful chapter on Friends history. They also took from William Allen one brass kettle, which the governor put upon him for his hat. He also went to Boston prison. When the marshal took the good wife's kettle, he said with a sneer, "Now, Priscilla, how wilt thou cook for thy family and friends? Thee has no kettle." Her answer was, "George, that God who hears the ravens when they cry will provide for them. I trust in that God, and I verily believe the time will come when thy necessity will be greater than mine." And that, we call that cause and effect in our thing. But it is true, George Barlow was a drunkard and a rough man, and he ended up later in life in poverty. And there's a little more to the story that I don't know that reconciled with the Allens, but it was just that little story is illustrative of how rough it was.
This was a cranberry bog, and after World War II, some Finnish guys decided they wanted to plant blueberry bushes, which are related to cranberries. So they planted all the blueberry bushes, and we've had to replace them, and there are 475 high bush blueberries in here.
An interesting shift took place, I would say, starting around 1890, 1900, 1910, where the older farms, which had been inhabited by the old names, Hoxie's and Giffords, those families started to fade out, and there weren't children to replace the old timers. And the farms were purchased by people who had come from Europe. A lot of Scandinavian influence, and very similar. I spent my first few years in West Barnstable, where there were, I grew up with names like Winnikainen, Hakkarainen, Mackie, Lampe. Those were regular names to me, but they were Finnish names. West Barnstable was became a Finnish village, and they were a people very skilled in farming and carpentry and cranberry growing. So I associate the Finns with cranberry bogs. And the same was true here in Spring Hill. For example, the farm, which I hope you'll visit, the Clark Hoxie House, was purchased by Victor Ahonen from Finland in 1911. And he and his neighbors became very successful at cranberry growing. And they're still here. There's a member of the family who is here today. I was so surprised to see John Ahonen. So that was, they still have a little influence here.
They took it over and were successful as a wholesale business. When we bought it in 1984, we turned it into a you pick your own business. Open mid-July when they ripen, and we're open every day, and the only reason we would be closed is if they need to ripen more because people have picked out all the ripe ones. Then also just a little fun fact is there was a middle building there that was a sauna. When the Finnish guys were, done with their little work, they would go take a sauna. So if you want to just look in this little shed,
I'm just listening.
Part of the tour too. This little shed is where you would come to when you're going to pick blueberries. You go in and you get a can and wear it around your neck, and then go to a bush and pick into the bush, pick into the can, And then we have a scale. You can dump the blueberries into the scale and we'll weigh them. Or we also, if you don't have a container to take them home, we have little quart containers. So that's for the month from mid-July to mid-August.
This is the Stephen Wing house. Stephen Wing came to this property in 1642 with his first wife. My background is in historic archaeology. That's what I used to do professionally. And when I came here, we immediately started doing archaeological surveys of the property to help us better understand what happened here when. And in doing so, we did indeed find postmolds from an earth-cast house, probably from the 1630s, that Stephen purchased from someone else. They lived in that hovel until they could afford to have this built. And this house is still here. This is what we're standing in right now. This room is basically the footprint of this second house. We initially knew the pitch of the roof because the last third of this gable sticks up through the floorboards in the attic. This is what they would have called a hall and parlor house, the hall being the kitchen where we are right now, and the parlor, sitting sleeping area directly above us with a little attic area above that. As they're adding on, they built over and around the original house, and you can see in this photograph, this is the gable end behind us stripped of its shingles. And if you look closely, you can see the front roof line here and the back roof line there. This was the back wall. And then this little boarded in window here, next to the big Georgian window, is the lead glass window that you see in the drawing. They don't tear the houses down when they rebuild for two reasons. Partly for economics. You've already got rooms that are existing. And secondly, these people are all farmers. You can't just pick up and walk away for several months while the timber framers are adding on to your house. So they're stuck here. So this house eventually gets covered over by this salt box. And this happens around 1680. Stephen's eldest son, Ebenezer, inherits the property, and he turns it into this salt box. And again, you can see the profile of this house in the sheathing boards on the west end of the attic, just like you can in that first house. You can even see the opening for this little lead window in the attic area. By 1760, when this interior, as you see it, happens today, the front of the house becomes a parlor system. We are in the second parlor. Both of these rooms are closed to the family. They live in the back of the house and they live upstairs. The women keep these rooms closed to keep them clean. Women had the longest list of anybody on these farms, and they did not have time to run around and worry about dust and things. There were people like Abigail Adams and people like that were the upper echelons that had servants and slaves and were able to keep house, but most people did not. This second parlor is going to be used for casual visiting, courting, and wakes, the most common things that happen in this parlor. The best parlor on the other side of the hallway is almost never open. That's only going to be open for a very prominent visitor or a very, very high occasion, like a wedding or something like that. But that's almost always closed. And that parlor tradition here in New England, anyway, lasts until fairly recent memory. My grandparents' house in Connecticut, you did not see that parlor unless it was Christmas or Thanksgiving. It was closed. And when you were invited in there, especially, I would have been probably your age or so, you sat on your hands. You didn't dare touch anything. So it's not a tradition that's eons old. It's still fairly recent memory.
Company, horticultural seeds. But John Foster had a French wife, And it was just this interesting social mix of French and Belgian speaking people here in Spring Hill, Finnish and Swedish, and the old Yankees as well. And there were some wonderful neighborhood feelings that came out of this blend, which fascinate me. There was a group which was very closely associated with Ida Putnam and her Greenbrier Jam Kitchen and Thornton Burgess. And these folks developed the pleasant habit of weekly beach picnics. And Ida Putnam, her staff, and neighbors, I think it was on a Friday night throughout the summer, would drive their Model Ts, park in a field, and carry all their homemade food out to the beach, where the Roos family, that's R-O-O-S, Roos Road, that's a Swedish name, had a beach cottage. And for years, they had these beach picnics. I mean, it went on for years. And I have photographs of these people out there having a great time. Somebody would bring a baseball and a bat, and they had lemonade and coleslaw and baked beans, and they spoke. The people I talked to some years ago who remembered it just spoke very glowingly of these. And there was a whole social group connected with that. Then there was the Spring Hill Neighborhood Club, which were a lot of the same people, but they would get together, initially men and women, at somebody's house and discuss literature or read something they had written and that sort of thing. And then I was told the men sort of faded away and it became more of a ladies group. And they, again, had tremendous fun. They would typically meet at someone's house and someone would actually keep minutes. There's years worth of minutes of these meetings. They would hire T. Eldred Holloway in East Sandwich to convey them to a restaurant. Even in those, I'm talking the 1920s. And Eldred had a Rio, R-E-O, truck, which was basically an open truck with a sort of a roof. And I have photographs of that too, all these ladies on the Rio truck being brought somewhere for entertainment. My point is that they really knew how to have fun here in Spring Hill. It had a reputation as a quiet Quaker village, farming and so forth, nothing real exciting happening, but a very good neighborhood feeling. And that's what sticks with me when I think about Spring Hill.
Been wonderful people from all over. A lot of local folks came, and then folks like these folks who just moved to South Yarmouth are, coming. They heard about our History Day and they live in an old house, so they were interested in seeing our old houses. That's why we did it. We wanted to really share the history of such an important historic area.